Hi friends, welcome back. We will continue our study of the Book of Ruth. Well, we are in the final chapter of our story. And if you recall from our last lesson, we left Naomi and Ruth waiting for Boaz to settle the matter. Ruth not only asked Boaz to marry her, but also to act as kinsman redeemer for Naomi and as a leveret for Naomi. So we begin in chapter 4. We pick up the story. Boaz goes back into Bethlehem now from the threshing floor to complete what he promised to Ruth he would finish. So we'll pick up the story at chapter 4, verse 1. Boaz went to the town gate and took a seat there. Just then, the family redeemer he had mentioned came by. So Boaz called out to him, "Come over here and sit down, friend. I want to talk to you." So they sat down together. Now, going to the town gate in that culture was where legal business was conducted. If you look at this picture, you can see it looks a lot different than what we would think of as a gate to a city or a town today. It was, in those towns, most of them would have had walls around them, and so this gate was where people passed through as they went from their home within Bethlehem out to the fields to work. And because of the structure of that town gate, it was also where you could set up booths or you could set up things. But it was an area where you also conducted legal business because a group could form there. There was room to come together. As we look at this reconstruction of an ancient gate, you can see how it looks different than our modern day gates would look like. It was a place where people could gather. And so that's where legal transactions took place. And don't you like how it says, it just so happened when Boaz got there that this other kinsman redeemer came by. Once again, we see God's hand at work here. It just so happened the timing was perfect. And so Boaz calls out to him. And I think it's interesting. I have seen some translations call him so-and-so. Boaz, in this translation, just said, friend. We never get to know his name. That's how much importance he has in the text. And he's really a bit of a counterpart to Orpah back in chapter 1. They are given opportunities. They make different choices. They're never condemned for their choices, but then they just kind of disappear out of the story. This kinsman redeemer doesn't even get a name. But both he and Orpah did not choose the more excellent way that Ruth chose and Boaz chose. We'll kind of keep that in mind as we go on through the story. So, verse 2. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here. And they did so. This is a legal quorum in those days. He's asking for a legal quorum. Now, if you can imagine, visualize this little village. People are passing out in and out of the gate, mostly out, to be honest, but they would hear Boaz call for this quorum, and they're curious. So some of them are going to hang around to see what's going on. The elders were probably heads of households, or the elders were probably heads of family and had that kind of legal authority in those days. We have to give Boaz a lot of credit. He chooses to do this in a public forum. He could have tried to slip this by in the back alley somewhere. He could have tried to slip this by in a back room, so to speak, do it privately, secretly, but he does it out in public. He wants this to be known not only by these 10 elders, but also by the villagers, what he is proposing. So we see his character once again. He is a man of integrity. So in verse 3, and Boaz said to the family redeemer, you know Naomi, who came back from Moab. She is selling the land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. He starts with Naomi because Boaz is part of this group of kinsman redeemers who have some responsibility for Naomi because of their kinship to Elimelech. So Boaz tells the group that Naomi is selling the land that belongs to Elimelech. Now, this is a bit murky because wives didn't inherit land. And so maybe what Boaz means is that Naomi is selling the right to redeem the land. The law is a little bit murky here, but it's also fairly dense, and it's possible that no one in that village was really clear on how that property worked in unusual cases like this. Boaz may also be suggesting that Naomi is selling the right to retrieve the land. And so Boaz says to this fellow kinsman, the closer redeemer, that this closer kinsman redeemer could buy that right to retrieve that land. Now that becomes rather attractive because now this kinsman redeemer, for a small price, could gain control of this land, bring it back into the family, but also it could be financially profitable for him. So verse 4, Boaz continues, I thought I should speak to you about it so that you can redeem it if you wish. If you want the land, then buy it here in the presence of these witnesses. But if you don't want it, let me know right away, because I am next in line to redeem it after you. The man replied, all right, I'll redeem it. To the kinsman redeemer, the offer at this point looks pretty attractive. He could redeem the land, Naomi's land, and it becomes part of his holdings that can then be passed on to his heirs. So the cost of redeeming the land would just be an investment in the future, and it could be very helpful to his family, and so he's in. I'll redeem it. Now, can you imagine at this point the crowd that is gathering? You know, life could be a little monotonous at times. Go home, go out to the fields and work, back home, and now we have this interesting transaction taking place. And so I suspect there were quite a few villagers that had gathered to listen in. In verse 5, then Boaz told him, of course, your purchase of the land from Naomi also requires that you marry Ruth, the Moabite widow. That way, she can have children who will carry on her husband's name and keep the land in the family. Now, Boaz at this point is interpreting the same way that Ruth had suggested to him, that the kinsman redeemer's responsibility also include that levirate piece. And so the kinsman redeemer would be fathering, hopefully, a son who would then inherit Elimelech's land and become Elimelech's heir. Needless to say, this changes the economic picture quite a bit for this kinsman redeemer, where before he could retrieve the land that belonged to Elimelech and then pass that on to his own heirs. Now he's being asked to father a son who could inherit Elimelech's land, so his price for the retrieval of that land would go to this son, and it's also possible that this could affect his other children. Now, he is taking a risk because Ruth is known to be barren, and so it's possible she would never deliver a son, and then he would be safe. But is it worth that risk? If she bore a son, it could endanger his entire estate, not just Elimelech's piece, and it could affect his inheritance for his own children. Now notice, I tried to emphasize it when I read it, but if you notice, Boaz emphasizes Ruth's Moabite status, her foreign status. This could be repulsive to some people, perhaps even to this kinsman redeemer. Boaz isn't sure, but he's laying that piece out there. You need to know the bad news as well as the good news here. And he's laying it out for the village too. I mean, the village knows, but the public often had a negative attitude toward foreigners. So you can feel the tension at this point. Ruth has laid out this plan with Boaz. Boaz has agreed to it. Naomi and Ruth are sitting at home waiting to hear the results. And now this kinsman redeemer has said, yeah, I'm in. I'll do it. Which wasn't really part of the plan. You could feel that tension. But there's more. Verse 6. Then I can't redeem it. the family redeemer replied, because this might endanger my own estate. You redeem the land. I cannot do it. Now remember, I don't see anything in this account that condemns him for this decision. He is just making an economic decision. He's willing to help out a family member, but he's also willing to let Boaz do it at this point. Boaz has laid out that bigger picture for him, and when this kinsman redeemer sees it, it's not worth the complications. He is willing to step aside since Boaz is willing to step forward. So at this point in our story, can't you just imagine fireworks going off? The celebration that Boaz feels. He has accomplished what he wants to accomplish. He has rescued both Naomi and Ruth. And there's just a few little minor details, loose ends to tie up. So let's read about those. In verse 7 and 8, we're told, and explained to us, now in those days, it was the custom in Israel for anyone transferring the right of a purchase to remove his sandal and hand it to the other party. This publicly validated the transaction. So the other family redeemer drew off his sandal as he said to Boaz, you buy the land. In those days, land was surveyed in triangles, and they used field stones as boundary markers, and men would walk off the boundary of that field. So the sandal represented, in a way, the title to the land, because they had walked on that sandal, walked around that land. It's a symbolic thing, but it's part of the legal transaction. So we'll continue. Then Boaz said to the elders and to the crowd standing around, you are witnesses that today I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. Boaz buys Naomi's property and goods and takes on complete responsibility for Elimelech's family. Boaz is now obligated to support Naomi for the rest of her life and to support her in her death. This broken family is restored. Who would have thought that could ever happen as we saw the grief and brokenness from chapter 1? But now, what was broken has been mended, has been restored. And on top of that, we have a marginalized outsider in Ruth brought into the community. We're going to learn more about that a little later. I want you to remember that Naomi, at the beginning of chapter 3, when she sent Ruth to Boaz, was in her own mind giving up Ruth for Ruth's own good. Naomi was willing to give up Ruth to protect Ruth from a life of isolation and poverty and being part of the marginalized of Bethlehem. But in doing so, she was sentencing herself to that life of isolation, of poverty, of being marginalized, of being that very bottom rung of worthless people. It was a tremendous sacrifice on her part. Kind of the idea of that widow's mite, giving everything she had out of love. And really, we can't ever lose sight of that in this entire story. I've talked a lot about how the chesed of God is illustrated throughout this story. And we see it in Naomi now as well. This is an incredible sacrificial act of giving up Ruth. But what's cool, as we see here, God is taking her sacrificial love, as well as Boaz's and Ruth's, spinning that into a new life, a new family, into restoration, newness. It's pretty exciting. We need to continue here with Boaz's legal strings that he's pulling together here in verse 10. And with this land I have acquired Ruth, the Moabite widow of Mahlon, to be my wife. This way she can have a son to carry on the family name of her dead husband and to inherit the family property here in his hometown. You are all witnesses today. So the fears that earlier kinsman redeemer had will fall on Boaz, who wants to father a son to continue the line of Elimelech, Mahlon, and so it will cost him. He will not gain all the financial rewards that the other kinsman redeemer had hoped to. Boaz is willing to shoulder this responsibility and take the obligations and the risks. I mean, Boaz probably has children as well who could lose out in this transaction, just like the other kinsman redeemer was concerned about his. But they may not lose out either. And we see Boaz moving forward in faith that God will take care of all those details. He is choosing to do what's right in God's eyes, to move forward in God's love and let God take care of all those other details. And as Boaz redeems a family line, he's also obligated, as we've already said, to give Ruth an opportunity to bear a son for this line of Elimelech and Mahlon. And once again, we see Ruth, the marginalized outsider, being brought into the community by the kindness and love of Boaz. And we've talked about it before, but we've come from the grief and death at the beginning of our story, full circle to life, or the potential of life at this point. And we really have to commend Boaz. He is a man of standing in his community, and he's taking leadership here. He is showing these villagers what can be done in God's name. I mean, we've talked about all the reasons he shouldn't do this. He's rich, she's poor. He's an Israelite, she's a Moabite. She's of that bottom class. He has great value. There are plenty of reasons he shouldn't do this. But Boaz is also, he's showing them how those things don't matter. What matters is kindness for one another and compassion and love. And it's a powerful message to those villagers and really to us today as well. We can look at that and say differences in classes, differences in backgrounds or cultures or even countries of origin are not as important as just seeing each other as people of value in God's eyes. Boaz does not care about these social restrictions. Ruth hinted to him earlier to follow the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, and Boaz has embraced that idea. And I think as we continue to wrestle with what's going on at the end of our story, this idea of spirit of the law is picked up in Jesus' teaching. Jesus also talked about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Think about, for example, the Sermon on the Mount. Let me read you a piece from Matthew 5, where he talks about the letter of the law and what God really is about. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or a sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire." I mean, Jesus is saying, okay, I know the letter of the law, but let me tell you what God's heart really is. And it isn't just, well, I haven't murdered anybody in my life. It has more to do with the condition of our heart. Have we hated anybody? Have we insulted anybody? We have violated God's law. Praise God for grace and salvation and restoration. I mean, in the Sermon on the Mount is an excellent place where Jesus gives us a picture of what God's heart is. But he summarizes what he was saying at the end of Matthew 5 when he says, "You have heard it said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." There's the spirit of the law. We have covered a lot of ground in looking at this idea of God's chesed. That word is used throughout the Old Testament, and we don't always know it because we don't have an English word that really translates it. So sometimes it's kindness, sometimes it's covenant, sometimes it's loving kindness. It can be a lot of different words used, but it's all of them put together. We have seen how it plays itself out in this story from the Book of Ruth. This story has gone from heartbreak to restoration, from loss to life, from emptiness to fullness. And the great news is, we're not done with this story yet. There's even more. This is a triumphant, victorious story to this point, and there's even more coming. So I hope you'll be back for the next lesson as we continue to unpack those final pieces of the Book of Ruth. There's more to this story than we could have imagined. So I hope you'll join me for the next lesson. Thank you. God bless you.